All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Let's begin. Beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Mem Aleph 41. We are picking up on Mem Aleph Amud Aleph at the two dots, which is 2, 4, 6, 7 lines down from the top, right at the two dots. So remember again, we're still in the middle of darshaning the pasuk by Par Ha'elam Davar Minat Tzibor. And we were using it in yesterday's daf ultimately to teach us the halachos concerning hazos, the necessity ultimately again for the blood applications by other karbanos. So today we're going to expound on that pasuk and ultimately use it to darshan a number of additional things. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says lipar. So the pasuk says lipar. Remember again, the pasuk we're referring to over here is Vayikra Daled Chaf Va'asa Lapar. Kasher asala par hachatos, kenye aselo v'chiper alehem hakoin v'nislach lohem. Fine. So now the Gemara dashes lipar. So what do I do with that word lipar? Lopar. Ze par helam davar shal tzibor. This ultimately refers to what? This refers to the par helam davar shal tzibor. The par that's brought when the Sanhedrin issues an erroneous ruling, and the populace acts on that ruling. But I don't understand. Why would that lepar ultimately go ahead and refer to par halam davar minat tzibor? At the end of the day, the pasuk itself is referring to par halam davar minat tzibor. So why in a pasuk that refers to par halam davar minat tzibor would I need another reference to the par? To which the Gemara says, ha b'tzibor gufei ksiva amar Rapapa. So we'll say Rapapa comes along and darshans the following idea, which is quite interesting. Rapapa says, Mishum deboy agmuri par ha'elam davar shal tzibor bioseres ushtei klayos l'siire abodos kochavim. So also listen to this. There's an interesting halacha called the oseres and shtei klayos. So shtei klayos are the kidneys. The oseres is the diaphragm of the animal. So the idea over here is that by certain karbanos, the kidneys and the diaphragm are offered up on the mizbeach. So Rapapa says over here the following. Rapapa says that we learn out from Par Halam Davar Shal Tzibor that just as by Par Halam Davar Minat Tzibor, the klayos, the two kidneys, as well as the diaphragm are offered up on the Mizbeach, so too by Si'iri Avodas Kochavim, so too by the goat offerings for Avodah Zarah. So ultimately, again, they are also offered up. So again, the Gemara says, Agmuri par helam davar shal tzibur bioseres ushtei klayos lis si'iri avodas kochavim. We learn from the fact that the par helam davar minat tzibur has the oseres and the kaved offered up, the oseres and the shtei klayos offered up, that the si'iri avodas kochavim also have them offered up. So the Gemara says, furthermore, par helam davar shal tzibur bigufei lo ksiv. Here's the issue. The issue is that the Torah does not explicitly say that the shtei klayos and the oseres are offered up by the par halam davar shal tzibor. That is not explicitly written in the pasuk. Instead, one of the ways in which we learn it out is through a hekish, is through a comparison. Here's the problem we'll say. The problem now, what you're telling me, is as follows. We learn out, just follow this train of thought for just a moment. We go ahead and we learn out the shtei klayos and the oseres, the diaphragm and the kidneys, are offered up by Seir of Avodah Zarah, and we learn that out from its comparison to Par Ha'elam Davar Shal Tzibor. Where do we learn out Par Ha'elam Davar Shal Tzibor, that the oseres and the shtei klayos are offered up? So the Gemara says we learn it out with a hekish. We're going to see exactly what that hekish is. The problem is, meaning that halacha is not explicitly written by Par Ha'elam Davar Minat Tzibor. It's also learned out by a hekish. Prabhupada says as follows, is in general, we try to avoid double hecation. What does that mean? That if something is learned out by a hekish, generally, I'm not going to use it as a source to teach something else. So I know that I'm learning out the oseres and shtei klayos by the Sirei Avodah Zarah, ultimately from Par Halam Davar Minat Tzibor. The problem is, it appears that Par Halam Davar Minat Tzibor itself is learned out from a hekish. Therefore, I have a problem. What do I do? How do I remedy this? Therefore, itzterich lepar lemehavi keman dichsiv bei begufei. Therefore, Rabbi said we darshan the extra lipar in the pasuk, an extraneous word in the pasuk, to teach me what halacha, to teach that the oseres and the shtei klayos are ultimately offered up on the mizbeach, and therefore, as a result, now I'm learning out that mandate from lipar, and therefore, again, I'm not learning out the ikra halacha of the oseres and shtei klayos from par halam min atzibur, from a hekish. Therefore, for lo lehave davar halamin behekish chozer umalamed behekish. Therefore, I'm able to avoid what? I'm able to avoid the issue of something which itself is learned out from a hekish, then being used to teach something else through a hekish. So as I saw, an interesting little bit roundabout limud. So Rav Papa understands that the extra lepar in the pasuk teaches me that we offer up the oseres and the shtei klayos, the diaphragm and the two kidneys of the animal on the mizbeach. On the mizbeach. So we'll say, why do I need that limud? After all, again, I already have another hekish. There's a comparison between parallel and davar tzibur and another thing that teaches me that the oseres and the shtei klayos are offered up. Here's the problem: is that we need parallel and davar minat tzibur to teach me that just as the oseres and the shtei klayos of par are offered up on the mizbeach, so to the oseres and shtei klayos of sirei avodah zarah are also offered up on the mizbeach. The problem is, if par is learned out through a hekish, then something that is learned out from a hekish can't or should not serve as a source of limud for a second hekish. Therefore, also, how do I avoid that problem? By learning the halacha of Yoseres and Shtei Klayos by par, not from a hekish, but rather by what? From the actual pasuk. How do I learn out from the pasuk? The extra word lipar. Also, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Amrav Papa, it's the fourth to last short line. So Amrav, before the lines get wide in Rashi. Amrav Papa, Hay lipar demoki Rabbi Shmuel bepar helam Mishum de la kaman ba'inan agmuri par ha'elam b'yoseres ha'kaved u'shtei klayos l'siri avodas kochavim behekesha dechatasam al shigagasam. So also we're going to see this limud on Amud Beis. Later on we're going to compare par ha'elam davar shal tzibor to siiri avodas kochavim, and to teach me that just as par ha'elam davar min tzibor, the kidneys and the diaphragm are offered up on the mizbeach, so too by the siiri avodas kochavim they're offered up on the mizbeach. So the Gemara says, "Upar ha'elam davar begufei lo ksiv yoseres u'shtei klayos." The problem is that by par itself, the Torah doesn't make mention that the kidneys and the diaphragm are offered up. Ella ve'es kol chel bo yakriv mimenu. All the pasuk says is that you go out and you offer up the chelev. You go out and you offer up the fats. Ube'akesha lahaykra gamar luhomi par koin mashiach dichsivi bei. So I'll say, really, the way it's actually very interesting. Really, the way I learn out that the oseres and shtei klayos, the diaphragm and the kidneys of the par helam davar min atzibor, that those were offered up on the mizbeach is through a comparison to the par kohen mashiach, to the par of the kohen. Dichsiv bei lachi itzrich lepar yisera lepar helam lichbol behekisha shniya dehabelav hachi iskish dehaikra bei uksiv kasher asa lepar zeh par kohen mashiach. The chazar v'kafa v'asal lepar zepar helam lichpo behekisho lelamed mimenu yoseres delehave hay hekisheni b'makom ksiva begufa delehave davar halamed behekish chazar malay behekisha. So we'll say so again. So one more time. So therefore, Rav Papa understands as follows. We're going to see later on Amud Beis. We're working a little bit backwards. That they're going to make a comparison between the sirah avodah zarah and the par helam davar min hatzibur to teach me what. That just as par halam davar min hatzibor, the oseres and the shtei klayos, the diaphragm from the two kidneys were offered up on the mizbeach, so too by the sirah avodas kochavim, the diaphragm and the kidneys were offered up on the mizbeach. The problem is that it would appear that par halam davar min hatzibor itself, the halacha that the diaphragm and the kidneys are offered up, seem to be learned out with a hekish to par kohen mashiach. So I'll say in general, and there's a logic to this, in general we say something that is learned out from a hekish, from a comparison, cannot serve as the source for a second comparison. So therefore I will say the issue over here is that if par halam davar min hatzibor is learned out from a hekish to par kohen mashiach, then it can't really serve as the source that the diaphragm and the kidneys are for the sirah avodah zarah is burned on the mizbeach. How do we remedy this? By ultimately darshaning the extra pasuk in the pasuk apar halam davar min hatzibor, that extra lepar teaches me that what? that the oseres and the shtei klayos, the kidneys and the diaphragm, are burned in the mizbeach. Therefore, it turns out that I can make the limud that the halacha is learned out not from a hekish, but rather from the pasuk itself. If it's learned out from the pasuk itself, then what? Then there's no problem for it to serve as the source of the hekish to the seir avodah zarah. Perfect. So says the Gemara goes weiter. Tanya kavasi de Rav Papa. We have a brayso that supports Rav Papa. What does the Gemara say? What does the Torah say? Va'asa kasher asa. Let's remember again. That's the shorthand version of quoting this pasuk that we're focusing on. Va'asa lepar kasher asa lepar achatos kenye asa lo v'chibra aleim. Fine. So the Gemara says it says va'asa kasher asa ma tamud lomar lepar. Why does it have to say lepar? Lefi shene'emar v'hem heviu es karbanam isha Hashem. Because the pasuk says they shall bring their karban, a fire offering to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Sefer Moshe, let's analyze this. So we're going to discuss this pasuk extensively on Amud Beis, but the pasuk says v'hem heviu es karbanam isha Hashem v'chatasam lifnei Hashem al shigagasam. So says the Gemara, watch this. Chatasam, what does chatasam refer to? Elu si'iri avodas kochavim. Okay, we'll say this refers to the seir offerings for avodah zarah, for worship avodah zarah. Shigagasam, if the community worships avodah zarah. Shigagasam. So what does it mean? They're shgaga. Ze par he'elam diavar shel tzibor. We'll say this refers ultimately again to the par he'elam diavar min tzibor. So we'll say ultimately again, what we see over here is as follows. That halacha lemaisa, the seiri avodas kochavim, right? So the offering for communal avodah zarah is written in the same pasuk as par ha'elam davar minat tzibor. So look at Rashi for just one more moment. V'heim heviu es karban. Rashi says, "Beparshas karbanos avodas kochavim ksiv." Remember, this pasuk is written in the section of avodah zarah. B'shlach lachom mikra yiseruhu l'drasha. Demalo lichtov zos v'nislach lahem kishkagahi v'hem heviu es karbanam lichtov v'nislach lahem v'nishtok el mishum debay lakushe seir avodas kochavim dimishtai bekra lepar ha'elam lahaktaras emurim. Okay, the Chsev Karban, I'm supposed to listen to this. Essentially, what the Gemara is saying is as follows: that halacha lemaisa, this pasuk that we just quoted, is an extraneous pasuk. The entire purpose or necessity of the pasuk is to create a linkage between seiri avodas kochavim and par ha'elam davar minat tzibor. That is the purpose of that pasuk. So, what's the linkage? What does the linkage teach me? So the Gemara says, "Chatasam al shigagasam." So the pasuk links chatasam al shigagasam. What's the connection there? Amra Torah. Torah teaches me as follows: Chatasam harehi lecha kishigagasam. Ultimately, again, I will say chatasam refers to the seiri avodah zarah to teach me that the chatas is just like the shkaga. The shkaga refers to what? Par ha'elam davar minat tzibor. Torah is coming to link seiri avodas kochavim to the par ha'elam davar minat tzibor. I will say, what is the linkage? So the Gemara says, so b'pashtos, what the linkage is just as the kidneys and the diaphragm of the par ha'elam davar minat tzibor is burnt on the mizbeach, hektaris emurin. So that same halacha applies to the seiri avodah zarah as well. Shigagasam mehechan lamarata. So I'll say, so where do I know that by par ha'elam davar minat tzibor we burn the oseres and the shtei klayos, that we burn the diaphragm and the two kidneys? After all, v'chi davar halamed behekish chozru umalamed behekish. After all, the Gemara says, we just said before, we're just reviewing that which Rav Papa said before. But here's the problem: isn't the halacha that we burn the diaphragm and the two kidneys of the par ha'elam davar minat tzibor, isn't that itself learned out from a hekish to what? To ultimately par koin Mashiach. If that's the case, how could something learned out from a hekish serve as then the proof for another hekish? Rather, what do you have to say? Talmud lomar lapar. Therefore, the pasuk says the extra word lapar, ze par ha'elam davar shel tzibor. That ultimately again refers to the par ha'elam davar shel tzibor. Lipar, ze par koin Mashiach. So we'll say, so interestingly enough, lipar, that refers to the par koin Mashiach. So we'll say, so bottom line is, it turns out that halacha lemaisa, Rav Papa suggests that we are not really learning out the obligation to burn the kidneys and the diaphragm from a hekish as much as learning out from a pasuk. So once I'm learning out that by a par ha'elam davar shel tzibor, I burn the kidneys and the diaphragm on the mizbeach, fine, I'm learning that out from the word lipar. Now again, I can use that for a hekish. Now also remember, the pasuk itself links chatasam al shigagasam, compares the seiri avodah zara to the par halam davar shel tzibor. What's the nature of that comparison? To say, just as by par halam davar shel tzibor, the kidneys and the diaphragm are burned on the mizbeach, so too by seiri avodah zara, the kidneys and the diaphragm are burned on the mizbeach. Beautiful. So what says the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara goes weiter. Amar Mar. Good. So Amar Mar. Chata Sam. Supposed to now we're going to go back and analyze that brisa just a little bit. So Amar Mar. Chata Sam elu sirei avodas kochavim. Supposed to, we just said before that what? When the pasuk refers to Chata Sam, that refers to seirei avodas kochavim. Right? That refers to the sin offering for avodah zara. Teipokle mikra kamo. So why don't I learn it out ultimately again from the previous passage? I'm going to say, look at Rashi just a moment. This is Rashi 5 lines up from the bottom. Seifokle. Rashi says, Yoseres hakaved l'seirei avodos kochavim. So why don't you learn out ultimately again the obligation to offer up the Yoseres hakaved to the seirei for I'm sorry. Why don't you go ahead and learn out the obligation to offer up the Yoseres hakaved for the seirei avodos kochavim? Why don't you learn it out from the previous pasuk? The Gemara says, Damar Mar, hachatos l'rabos sirei avodas kochavim. So when the pasuk goes ahead and says hachatos, that refers to the sirei avodas kochavim. Look at Rashi, last 2 lines. Damar Mar hachatos elu sirei avodas kochavim. Lama lisu hach dechatasam al shigagasam. So both say, if that's the case that the previous pasuk refers to sirei avodas kochavim, then what do I need the chatasam for? Papa says, no, I'll tell you why we need it. It's derech. Sakadait chamina, watch this. I'm at thought as follows. Hani mili hazoos diksivan bigufei. Before you turn the page, look at the last Rashi. Sakadait hani mili disrabu sevadas kochavim ledin par helam. Both say I'm at thought as follows. What does the comparison? See, here's what we know. Chatasam al shigasam. Both say the pasuk itself links. Chatasam is a reference to the seirei avodah zara, the offerings brought for communal idolatry, and it's comparing it to the par ha'elam davar shel tzibor, right? So Torah is linking those 2 karbanos. So obviously what it's telling me is what? Whatever applies, or certain things that may apply by par ha'elam davar mitzibor, apply also to seirei avodah zara. Now, what we were trying to say is, what does the comparison accomplish? The comparison says that just as you have to burn the kidneys and the diaphragm of the par ha'elam davar shel tzibor, you also have to burn them by the seirei avodah zara. The Gemara now suggests maybe the comparison teaches me something else. I might have thought as follows. Look at Rashi, last Rashi on the daf. Sakadait chamina hanimili disrabu sirei avodas kochavim ledin par ha'elam. I might have thought Rabbi say, but ultimately again we compare sirei avodas kochavim to par ha'elam davar shel tzibor lahazoos dichsivan bigufei behedja aval yoseres uklayos lo. I might have Rabbi say the comparison means as follows. Just like the par ha'elam davar shel tzibor requires blood applications, so too the seirei avodah zara also require blood applications. And I will say, here's the beauty of that comparison. The beauty of that comparison is that those blood applications are written explicitly by the par ha'elam davar shel tzibor. So because they're written explicitly, I would have thought the comparison only applies to those things written explicitly. As we've already seen, the obligation to burn the kidneys and the diaphragm is not written explicitly, but instead simply learned out from the extra word lepar. So I might have thought that the comparison just says, just as the par ha'elam davar shel tzibor requires blood applications, so too the seirei avodah zara requires blood applications. Amud beis, aval yoseres uklayos, ushtei klayos. The lo ksivan bigufei emalo, but I might have thought that what? That halacha l'maisa, the burning of the kidneys and the diaphragm, which although we know is a halacha by the par ha'elam davar shel tzibor, the comparison between seirei avodas kochavim and par ha'elam davar shel tzibor doesn't allow me to learn out that you have to burn the kidneys and diaphragm by the seirei avodas zara for one simple reason. It's not written explicitly by the par ha'elam davar shel tzibor. Therefore, the Gemara says, Kamash malo no. Kamash Nabal say that halacha l'maisa, according to Rav Papa, what we have now established is as follows. The extra word lepar in the pasuk is referring to par ha'elam davar shel tzibor. What do we learn out from that extra lepar? We learn out that by the par ha'elam davar shel tzibor, like the par koin Mashiach, we burn the kidneys and the diaphragm on the mizbeach. Then the pasuk comes along, chatasam l'shigagasam. Or I should say, V'chatasam l'fnei Hashem al shiggasam. Chatasam is a reference to Siyai Avodah Zarah. Shiggasam is a reference to Par Halam Davar Shal Tzibor. The Torah is linking these two things. Par Halam Davar Shal Tzibor and Siyai Avodah Zarah. What's the point of the linkage? So now Rav Papa says the point of the linkage is to teach me that just as by Par Halam Davar Shal Tzibor, one has to burn the kidneys and the diaphragm on the Mizbeach, so too by the Sirei Avodah Zarah, one burns the kidneys and the diaphragm on the Mizbeach as well. Beautiful. Let's go weiter. Amli Rafuna Breid Rav Nasan L'Rav Papa. Suppose now the Gemara goes weiter a little bit. So Rav Huna Breid Rav Nasan said to Rav Papa, V'ha Tana Par Yom Kippurim L'chol Ma Sha'amar Be'inyan Ka'amar. So we'll say now let's take a step back for just a moment. So Rav Huna Breid Rav Nasan said to Rav Papa, but I don't understand. We learned elsewhere that what? That Par Yom Kippurim L'chol ma she'inyan sha'amar be'inyan ka'amar. But let's take a look at Rashi for just a moment. So the Gemara says, V'ha tana l'rabos par yom kippurim l'chol ha'inyan ka'amar Ama kula milsa yolif minei va'afilu ikuva va'at amrit le'es bedam u'betvila. So I'll say ultimately again the Gemara says as follows. So Rav Huna Rav Nasan said to Rav Papa that we learned out ultimately again that we learned out from Par Yom Kippurim, the Chol Mashar B'inyan. Well, so we learned out from Par Yom Kippur to Par Helam Davar Shal Tzibor to teach me that everything that is in effect by the Par Yom Kippurim is in effect by the Par Helam Davar Shal Tzibor, which Avosai means what? Which means that just as by Par Yom Kippurim, Matonos Ma'akvos, if you don't have the proper blood applications, the carbon is compromised. So too by Par Helam Davar Shal Tzibor, if you don't have the proper blood applications, so the carbon is compromised as well. So the Gemara says, Tanaihi. If you remember again, on yesterday's daf, towards the end of Mem Amud Aleph, the top of Mem Amud Beis, so both say you can remember we made the drashos of Es, Dam, and Tvila. Right? We spoke about those various drashos. Ultimately, again, speaking about Es, was that even if the coin has a blister on his finger, the hazah is still good. Badam, there has to be enough blood. Tvila, you can't scrape it off the side of the kli. Has to be enough blood inside the kli itself. So now Rav Huna B'rid Rav Nasan is asking on Rav Papa, I don't understand. We use the drasha for something else. To which the Gemara says, Tanahi. In reality, Rabbi said there is a machlokes tanoim. It's machlokes tanoim. Watch this. This is actually a fascinating machlokes. Tana debate Rav Marbi Hachi. The Tana of Rav, right, of the yeshiva of Rav, learns it out in the following way. Tana de Rabbi Shmuel lo Marbi Hachi. The Tana de Rabbi Shmuel will say does not learn it out in the same way. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Tana de Rav Marbi Hachi. Kol Tan Rabbanan Kari Tana de Rav. Hayi Masnisin Kamaisa lo Marbi le Ela le'es bedam utvila ve'ikuva nafkale michuka. So we'll say, here's what's interesting. What's interesting is that there's general agreement as to the halachos in question over here, namely, that just as the various parts of the carbonic service of Yom Kippur are ma'akiv kapara, right? So too again, those same parts of the service are ma'akiv ultimately again in par ha'alam davar shel tzibor, right? So we'll say, but at the end of the day, the machlokes is where we're going to learn it out from. So the Gemara essentially says as follows: that the Tana Debei Rebbe, learned Marbi Hachi. In fact, learns it out like this: Tana Debei Rabbi Shmuel lo Marbi Hachi. So let's explain this. We'll say as follows. So Tana Debei Rabbi Shmuel lo Marbi Hachi. Tana Debei Rabbi Shmuel. So watch this. So I'm sorry. Let's read that again. Tana Debei Rav Marbi Hachi. The Tana of the Yeshiva Rav will say, in fact, learns it out this way. We're going to explain each of these in just a moment. Tana Debei Rabbi Shmuel lo Marbi Hachi. The Tana of the Yeshiva Rabbi Shmuel will say, does not learn it out this way. What's the drasha that's being inferred over here? Tana Debei Rabbi Shmuel. So we'll say, watch this. So the Tana Debei Rabbi Shmuel learns as follows. It's actually a beautiful limud. Mipnei man ne'emru yoseres ushtei klayos bepar koin mashiach v'lo ne'emar bepar ha'alam davar shal tzibor. So we'll say, here's what's interesting. What we established already in the previous limud is what? Is that there is an obligation to go ahead and burn the kidneys and the diaphragm, both by par halam davar shal tzibor as well as by the par kohen gadol. Right? We've already established this. What else did we establish? The obligation is written explicitly by the Par Koin Mashiach, but is not written at all where? By the Par Helam Davar Shal Tzibor. We'll say, right, that was the whole drasha of Rav Papa. We learned it out from the extra Lepar. Tana de Rabbi Shmuel asks, why not? Why not? If indeed the obligation to burn the kidneys and the diaphragm applies equally to Par Helam Davar Shal Tzibor as it does to the Par Koin Mashiach, then why not write it explicitly? Why not write it? It's a good shiloh. Why not write it explicitly? So the Gemara says again, why is the Torah explicitly writes the obligation to burn the kidneys and the diaphragm by the Par Koin Mashiach, but yet it's not written by Par Helam Davar Shal Tzibor? Again, one more time. When we say that it's not written by Par Helam Davar Shal Tzibor, what does that mean? It's not written, although we know that what? There is an obligation. We know that we do burn the diaphragm and the kidneys by the Par Helam Davar Shal Tzibor. We learn out, again, we learn out from the par. But why isn't it written explicitly? Let's listen to this beautiful idea. Mushal. We'll say, this is as good as we're going to get with Agadata, right? This mushal, this is, so enjoy this. Mushal, I'm just kidding. There is more Agadata. Mushal lemelech basar vadar. We'll say this can be compared to an earthly king. Sheza'am al ohavo. Who gets upset at a person he loves. So the king is someone who he loves, and he gets upset at the person who he loves. Umiet bisirchuno mipnei chibaso. And ultimately what does he do? He goes ahead and he minimizes, literally again, the musar. Sirchona literally means the degradation. He minimizes the degradation that he heaps upon this person because he loves him. In other words, we'll say, if the king has someone who he loves, but that person who he loves wronged him in a significant way, the king, out of his love for the posher, for the transgressor, will minimize the amount of degradation he heaps upon him. So we'll say, what's the name shal over here? Look at Rashi for just a moment. So Rashi understands the mashal, although understanding this mashal is a bit of a machlokes rishonim. We're just going to focus on Rashi over here. Al ohavav. So Rashi understands in the nimshal, obviously the king is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The loved one who transgresses is Klal Yisrael, right? We'll say that's a reference to the Par Helam Davar Shal Tzibor. Miyetz b'sirchuno kitzer b'dvarim. We'll say, listen to how beautiful this is. The Par Koin Mashiach is the sin offering of an individual. The Par Helam Davar Shal Tzibor, we'll say, is where the majority of the Tzibor transgresses. The nimshal is Kadosh Baruch Hu is the king, right? So when the king has someone who he loves who transgresses against him, so there's going to be a punishment, but the king limits the amount of degradation he heaps upon his loved one because he loves them. So too, Kadosh Baruch Hu loves us, Klal Yisrael. When Klal Yisrael sins as manifest by what? By the need to bring the Par Helam Davar Shal Tzibor. So Kadosh Baruch Hu minimizes the degradation. What's the minimization of the degradation? Torah doesn't explicitly say that you have to offer up the kidneys and the diaphragm on the Mizbeach. We know you have to do it, we learn it out, but the Torah doesn't explicitly say it, kind of as a way of minimizing the degradation of Klal Yisrael. So we'll say an incredible and beautiful mashal. Even when HaKadosh Baruch Hu gets upset at us, and even at the end of the day when we've done something wrong, and even when there's an obligation ultimately again to make amends for that which has been done wrong, the Rachmanas of the Ribbon Shalom is always there. Even in a very small and nuanced way, he wants to minimize ultimately again the degradation heaped upon Klal Yisrael. An incredibly beautiful idea. We'll say what the Gemara is saying is as follows: by going ahead and not explicitly articulating or stating some of the parts of the sacrificial service, the Gemara sees that as a minimizing of the degradation of Klal Yisrael. The Tana de Rabbi Shmuel. So we'll say again, the Shir Rabbi Shmuel we see as follows. Watch this. Mipnei man ne'emar parochas hakodesh bepar koin Mashiach. So we'll say, listen to this. The pasuk says as follows: V'tavala koin es etzva'o badam. So the kohen will go ahead and dip his finger in the blood. The Gemara says, the pasuk says, "V'hiza min adam sheva pamim lifnei Hashem es pnei parochas hakodesh." So we'll say, so the pasuk over here says the kohen will dip his finger in the blood and he will sprinkle it 7 times on the curtain of the kodesh, right, which is the curtain that divides between the kodesh and the kodesh hakadoshim. So watch this. Mipnei man ne'emra parochas hakodesh bepar kohen Mashiach v'lo ne'emar bepar helam davar shal tzibor. So we'll say, now watch this. Now the halacha is both karbanos, the Par Koin Mashiach, as well as the Par Helam Davar Shal Tzibor, will say both of them have an obligation of hazah on the curtain. But yet, interestingly enough, the obligation is explicitly stated, or I should say, it uses the word paroches hakodesh by par kohen Mashiach, but yet doesn't use that same verbiage by par halam davar shel tzibor. Why not? To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Mashal melech basar vadam shesarcha alav medina. But also this can be compared to a human king, where let's say again his constituents rebelled. Right? His medina rebelled. So what happens? Immiuta sarcha. If some of them rebelled, it's okay because pamalya shalom is kayemes. Ultimately, again, his kingdom is still preserved. Even if some rebelled, his kingdom is still preserved. Imruba sircha. But ultimately, again, if the majority of his kingdom rebelled, then what? Ein pamalya shalom is kayemes. Then I will say what? Then the majority. If the majority rebelled, then his kingdom is no longer intact. What's the name? Shal? Look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, "Mipnei ma ne'emra parochas hakodesh garas bepar kohen Mashiach ksiv es pnei parochas hakodesh ubepar ha'ida ksiv es pnei hakaporas." So we'll say ultimately against Rashi just pointing this out by par kohen Mashiach it says parochas hakodesh, but yet by the par halam davar shel tzibor it just says pnei parochas. So what's the pshat? Pamal yishlo Rashi says kenisas chaburas atzaso. Umihamaskimim ladaito asher divrei sasra alehem imruba sarcha. So we'll say if a king has a kingdom and the majority of his constituents rebel, in pamalya shelo kayemes, his monarchy is not preserved. Harehu mesulak michibasam umachnisem b'miktzas vein libo gaspa in kebarishona. So we'll say furthermore, if the subjects rebel and his kingdom is no longer intact, the king no longer has the warmest feelings towards his constituents. Hachanami, kevim durov tzibur sarcha, kiriyacha in kan kidusha. So this is actually quite amazing. When it's the par kohen Mashiach, so that's only one person, so to speak, who's rebelled. The relationship between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Am is still intact. Therefore, uses the Foloshna Parochas HaKodesh. But when it's a par helam davar shel tzibur avosai, where what? Where in this case, again, the majority of the tzibur has done something wrong, so there is a certain degree of relationship erosion between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Klal Yisrael. How is that relationship erosion manifest itself? It doesn't say Parochas HaKodesh, it just says Parochas. Almost Rabosai, as that lack of a word shows a certain emotional withholding of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The relationship is not the same when the Klal as a whole, the majority of the Klal sins, even though, again, remember, this is an accidental sin. This is not intentional. But at the end of the day, again, when there is national sin, there is a bit of relationship erosion that manifests itself in a little bit of a shorthand version of the pasuk. It doesn't say Parochas HaKodesh, instead it just says Parochas. Masha'in King, when it's just the Kohen Gadol who has sinned, but the nation, the relationship with the nation is still intact, it uses the full verbiage of Parochas HaKodesh. Beautiful Gemara. But let's go weiter. Levichach, im nasan kulo ketiknon. Therefore, we'll say the pasuk says as well. So remember, now the Gemara is quoting from the Mishnah. Now the Mishnah said, and here we're going to get into a very interesting. Now, I just want to point out, as I mentioned before, I gave you that mashal nimshal according to Rashi, right? Marsha, others have a dramatically different interpretation, but we'll save it for the next machzer. So we'll say, remember again, the Mishnah said as follows. The Mishnah said that v'vichach kula nasan kula kintignon. We'll say if when a person did all of the blood applications, kitignon in the right way, va'achas shelo kitignon. Now this is about the chata, so there are 4 blood applications. So let's say a person ultimately again did all of them correctly, but one of them incorrectly. So what's the halacha? The carbon is pasul ve'in bo kares. So ultimately again the carbon is pasul, but lemaisa again there's no kares. Okay, so no kares, meaning it doesn't become pigul. So we'll say, now watch this. It's actually a fascinating sugya. Tanan Hasam. Pigal bekomis v'lo b'levona. We'll say v'lo b'levona v'lo bekomis. Remember again, it's around a carbon mincha. So a carbon mincha, we'll say, has 2 parts. There is the kometz, which is when the kohen takes the flour, ultimately again with his 3 middle fingers. And then there is the levona, the burning of the frankincense. So we'll say, let's say again, the kohen has a machshavas pigul, which means he has in mind to go and, let's say, eat the carbon outside of the prescribed time, chutz lizmano, but he only has the machshavas pigul by the kometz, but not by the levona, or by levona v'lo b'kometz. Or we'll say what? Ultimately again in the levona, but not by the kometz. So we'll say, in other words, he only has the machshavas pigul only when? only by one part of the avoda. So what's the halacha? Rabbi Meir Omer Pigel v'chayav and alav kares. Rabbi Meir says that's enough. Machshavas Pigel by one part of the avoda is enough to what? Is enough to go ahead and make the carbon Pigel in your chayav kares. The chum say no. Ein bo kares achi paga b'chalamati. This is amazing. The chachamim say that a carbon could only become Pigel when Rabbi say only you have a machshavas Pigel by what we call b'chol hamatir. Only if you have machshavas Pigel ultimately by what we call the matirin, the necessary carbonic steps. Only if you have the machshavas Pigel by all of those steps does the carbon become Pigel. But if you just have a machshavas Pigel by one of those steps, that does not make the carbon Pigel. Also, watch this. Rabbi Shimon Lakish. Also, understand this is an enormous machlokes, because what you have over Rabbi is as follows. You have Rabbi Meir essentially saying that once you have machshavas Pigel by one of the necessary avoda steps, that makes the carbon Pigel in its entirety, even if you did not have that kavanah subsequently, by the subsequent steps. Comes to no. In order for a carbon to become Pigel, there has to be a machshavas Pigel in all of the permitting steps. B'chol hamatir, all of the permitting steps. So now watch this. Lo tema, time of Rabbi Meir, the kasavar mefaglin b'chatzi matir. Now we'll say, now what's Rabbi Meir's logic? So Reish Lakish says, don't assume that Rabbi Meir's logic is because he holds mefaglin bechatzi matir. We'll say mefaglin bechatzi matir means that ultimately, again, even if you have machshavas Pigel by one of the permitting steps, that's enough. That's not Rabbi Meir's logic. What's Rabbi Meir's logic? Watch this. Kigon shenasan esakomets b'machshava v'halavona b'shtika. But Rabbi Meir's case is as follows: where when doing the kamitza, the Kohen had in mind for Pigel. The Kohen had in mind to eat it 2 days from now. When he offered up the lavona, he had no intent. B'shtika. What does Rabbi Meir hold? Kasavar kala ose al das rishona hu osa. And I will say, what's Rabbi Meir's logic? Rabbi Meir's logic I will say is that halacha l'maisa, when you begin a process with particular das, and then again you don't have any das to the contrary, that first das governs the process in its entirety. Therefore, what? Therefore, halacha l'maisa, if I'm the Kohen and I do the kamitza with machshavas Pigel, I have in mind to eat the carbon 2 days from now, and when I subsequently do the lavona, then what? I have no das. Then we assume that the first das that I had by the kamitza governs the rest of the carbonic process. That's why it's Pigel. We'll say that what we call kala ose al das rishonahu osa. Whoever conducts himself based on the first das I had, unless of course what? At some point in time I have contrary das. Mimai. Now where do we see this from? Midiktani, what did the Mishnah say? Lefichach im nasan kulan kintiknon va'achas shelo kitikna pasol. Remember again, what did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah said if I did all of the azos, all of the blood applications, ketiknan, in the right way, and it's just the last one that I didn't do in the right way, pasal, ultimately, again, the carbon is pasal, ve'ein bo kares. And Abba said there is no kares obligation. What do you see from here? Ha'achas shelo ketikna, ve'kulan ketiknan, pigol. Well, so I could infer from the Mishnah that what? That if I were to do, right, one of them, shelo ketikna, if I were to do one of them inappropriately, the chulan kitiknan, in other words, if I were to do one with machshavas Pigel, and the rest of them kitiknan. Now, we'll say kitiknan, what we're explaining over here means that lamais, I'm doing all of them correctly, but still under the same das as the first one. Pigel, there make it Pigel. Money. We'll say, does that reflect? If you want to say it's the Rabbanon, Hami Rabbanon, Imafaglim Mechatzi Matir, the Rabbanon say the only way a carbon becomes Pigel, Abba says how, is if you have Machshavas Pigel with every necessary step of the carbonic process. Ela Rabbi Meir. Rather, it must be Rabbi Meir. So the Gemara says, V'i time Rabbi Meir Mishon Imafaglim Mechatzi Matir. And if you want to say that Meir's logic is what? That you could go ahead and affect Pigel even just by having Pigel, even just by having Machshavas Pigel in one of the avodas. So the Gemara says, nami. So if that's the case, ultimately again, then it should become Pigel, even in the case of the Mishnah. To which the Gemara says, Lav mishum de kasavar, kolo osa adas rishona osa. It must be able to say that Rabbi Meir's logic is that what? When you have an initial das, and that das is never upended by a secondary das, that das governs the entire carbonic process, even if I didn't have in mind, by the subsequent avodos. Therefore, I will say, if I begin the carbonic process with a machshavas pigul, and again I have shtika, I have no other das with the rest of those avodos, so Meir holds that makes the carbon pigul. Amr B'Shmuel Yitzchak the Olam Rabbanon. B'Shmuel says no. The Mishnah can reflect the view of the Rabbanon. Umay ketiknon. What does it mean when a Mishnah says that I did the subsequent avodos ketiknon? Ketiknon le pigul. Well, so what it means is I did them in accordance, namely to make it pigul. It doesn't make sense. V'hadik tani lefichach im nasan kulan ketiknon va'acha shelo ketiknon pasal ve'in bokaris. Also, when the Mishnah says, therefore, if I went ahead and what? I did all of the hazos ketiknon, and one shelo ketiknon, the carbon is possible, but there's no karis. Michlal, the tikna lach shiruhu dasa. Both said it sounds like the lashon of ketikna ultimately means I'm doing the hazo in the right way. Amar Rava says no. My shelo ketikna. What does it mean when it says that I do shelo ketikna? Chutz limkomo. Both say that ultimately means what? That means that I have kavana to go ahead and eat the carbon outside of the prescribed area. Ravashi Amar shelo l'shmo. Ravashi says, ultimately, again, I have in mind to it shelo l'shmo. Michlal, both say now that indicates to me Michlal dechilo avad lo chutz limkomo v'shelo l'shmo mechayiv. If that's the case, I will say that it sounds like that if I don't do the last hazah with the intention of chutz limkomo and chutz lishmo, that I would be chayiv. To which the Gemara says, if that's the case, I did the Tana Reisha Pigul, the Chayavan alav Kares, so to which the Gemara says, you're right. But rather, we're just trying to preserve Mishnaic symmetry. Since the Reisha said Pigul, the Chayavan alav Kares, therefore the Seifa, Tananami Seifa Pasol, the Ein Bo Kares. Therefore, the Mishnah also uses the same symmetry, the same Lashon over here, and says Pasol, the Ein Bo Kares. But at the end of the day, the Gemara says that we don't say, Kala osa al das rishono osa. But we do not accept the premise that was ascribed to Rabbi Meir, namely that when you begin an avodah with a particular machshava, that machshava governs the rest of the avodah. I just want to end off with one piece. So how do we pass in this machlokes? Remember again, the Gemara the Gemara interpreted the Mishnah, but how do I end off in this machlokes? Rabbi Meir and the Chacham say. Remember again, the shaila over here is what happens if I went ahead and I started an avodah. For example, I'm offering a karban mincha. I did the kamitza with machshavas pigul, but I didn't burn the levona with machshavas pigul. So Rabbi Meir says in that case, halacha lemaisa, as long as you began the sacrificial process with a machshavas pigul and you didn't have any other das to the contrary, then what? Then the carbon is pigul. Now both say now, but pashtus, the way we ascribe Rabbi Meir's sheet is that what? Kala osa al das rishonahu osa. That when you go ahead and you do something, assuming you only had one das, that das governs the process in its entirety. The Chachamim say no. In order for a carbon to become pigul, there has to be machshavas pigul where? B'chol matirin. In every step of the carbon. So we'll say, how do we paskin in that area? Or say in that machlokes. So the Rambam will say paskins in Hilchos Psuli HaMukdash and Parak Tezayin Halacha Zayin. Listen to this. Chashav machshavas zman b'shas kmitza avalo b'shas likot halavona. O shechashav machshavas zman b'shas likot halavona avalo b'shas kmitza harei ze psula. Ve'eno pigol ach yachshav machshavas hazman bechol hamatir shu akometz im halavona b'shas kemitzas akometz v'likot halavona o b'shas asinas shneim bekli o b'shas haluchan o b'shas rikaz. So say halacha lemaisa. The Rambam paskins like the Chachamim, namely that a carbon only becomes pigol when if a person ultimately again has a machshavas pigol. By ultimate yachshav machshavas bechol hamatir. So both say in order for the carbon to become pigul, you have to machshavas pigul, what we call bechol hamatir, in every step of the carbon which permits the carbon. So in the case ultimately again of karban mincha, that's a suman over here. Karban mincha, it is both the kemitza as well as the collection and the bringing of the levona. Now I will say if a person has a machshavas pigul during only one of those stages, then what? It won't make the carbon pigul, but will make the carbon pasul. So ultimately, I will say we've seen this already before. You can become pasul even if you're not pigul. Ultimately, again, the Rambam Pask is like the Chachamim that in order for the carbon to become pigul, one has to have machshavas pigul b'chol hamatirin.